Hi everyone. So one of the more common questions I've been getting lately is whether to get the newly released E-M5 Mark III or just get the E-M1 Mark II, which has been out for about 3 years. Because in terms of features and image quality, the cameras are virtually identical. I mean, there are some substantial differences, which I'll get into, and they may or may not be deal breakers for you. But I wanted to help you make that decision today. Now, I own both of these cameras, the E-M1 Mark II and the E-M5 Mark III, and I've had the E-M1 Mark II now for about 2.5 years, and I've had this one for just about a couple of weeks actually. And I've attached similar lenses. This E-M1 Mark II now has the 75-300, and then I have the 12-40 Pro here on the E-M5 Mark III. And I wanted to go over the most obvious difference first, which is, just the overall size. Now, I do have an Arca Swiss plate on the bottom here, so just ignore that. But you can see that the E-M5 Mark III is much smaller and thereby much lighter than the E-M1 Mark II. And if we look at the grip here, you can see that the grip is much more substantial on the E-M1 Mark II. So let's just get a closer look at the E-M1 Mark II's grip and compare that. Now, when I put my hand onto the camera, you can see there's a lot of space here between the lens and my fingers. And then looking at it from this direction, again, you can see there's still quite a bit of room here between my fingers and the lens, because the grip in of itself does allow your fingers to come straight down away from the lens, and then when you hold it, you have plenty of room here. And my hands, I have small hands. I wear like a size small glove. But when we look at the E-M5 Mark III, look at the grip here. It does have a deeper grip than the Mark II, but the E-M5 Mark II. But you'll notice when I put my hands on it, there's nowhere near as much space between my fingers and the lens. And actually my fingers rub just a little bit as I'm bringing my hand in. Now, that said, this camera is easy enough to hold with this lens, and that this lack of space here does not interfere with me using the camera in any way. And this feels fine, this 12-40 Pro. I mean, honestly, it's a little bigger that lens than I would use with a camera like this, but a lot of you are going to buy this lens because it's a terrific lens. So I wanted you to see how it looks on this camera. So it's not bad though. So if the grip itself is not a deal breaker, what's another deal breaker maybe? Well, to me that might be the battery life. The E-M1 Mark II's battery is substantially stronger or lasts longer than the E-M5 Mark III. And I'll just give you a real world shooting example. I took this camera out yesterday for a couple of photo jobs. And I had about, honestly, I'd say about 3 hours of constant shooting where I didn't put the camera down. About an hour and a half at one job and about an hour and a half at another job. And during those two different jobs, I never stopped taking pictures, other than maybe a 30 seconds to a minute difference between each shot. And I still had 22% battery life left when I got back home. Now, the E-M5 Mark III, I use this camera very differently. I use this for my vlogging and photo walks, and I've taken this out about 5 times now for photo walks and vlogs. And I get about 30 to 40 minutes of video, and then I get about 100 to 300 shots of photos when I'm out on my photo walks. And that's roughly equates to about 2 hours of total walk time with this camera before I really need to change the battery or it just dies on me. But keep in mind, that's taking images, every now and then, recording video every now and then. It's not constant 3-hour use like I did with the E-M1 Mark II. With this camera, I've never done 4 or 5 hour photo walks, but I would feel pretty confident this would go at least twice as long as the E-M5 Mark III. Then the last thing that might be a deal breaker for some people is the fact that the E-M1 Mark II has dual card slots. If you're doing any kind of professional work, this is almost mandatory nowadays. Now for me personally, it's not a big deal, even in my pro work, because a lot of times I'll just do images on this card and then I'll do video on this card. And I'm never in a situation where I can't just come back the next day and take the pictures again. But if you're like doing event photography, like a wedding or a conference or something, you don't have a second chance, right? So having this is a real peace of mind, and that may be the single most important reason to get this camera over the E-M5 Mark III. Now another thing that might be a deal breaker is the build of the camera itself. This camera, when you hold it in your hands, the E-M1 Mark II, feels very substantial because it basically has a metal shell and metal framing inside. And anywhere you hold this camera, like I said, it feels very substantial. Granted, it has a little more heft and weight to it, but that's what goes with having a solidly built camera. And the buttons and the dials and everything also feel very, very good. Just a little better than on the E-M5 Mark III. Now the E-M5 Mark III, on the other hand, has an all-plastic shell and with a metal frame inside. But I don't think there's any question about the durability of this camera in terms of, you know, its strength and weather sealing, etc. This is a very tough camera, but it is plastic. You know, the best way I describe it is like if you grab a screwdriver handle and feel the plastic on that, that's kind of like what the plastic on this feels like. It's very solid. There's no flex in the camera. And, you know, if you look at like my TG5, for example, this is all plastic. And I know this camera's tough because, and not on purpose, but I've thrown this camera across the street on the concrete and barely a scratch on it, and it works just fine. And I've done that more than once, trust me. And I've had no problems with this camera. And believe it or not, on my second photo walk, I actually dropped this camera from about, I don't know, chest high or so, down onto a concrete sidewalk. And it landed right on the power button. And the camera still works fine, but the little button cap that was on here kind of popped off, which, you know, I have to send in for repair, but the camera works fine. So I wouldn't worry about the durability or weather sealing just because it's made of plastic. But that being said, it does feel very different in your hand. It doesn't have that sort of substantial high quality feel that you get when you grab like the E-M1 Mark II. So now let's talk about a couple other things that may or may not help you make a decision between these two cameras. The E-M1 Mark II has the option to add a vertical battery grip with buttons and dials and everything's on it. So you can operate the camera horizontally or vertically with pretty much the same functionality. And the grip itself will store 2 batteries. So this will definitely last you all day long. And that may be a huge advantage or an upgrade path that you want to consider when you get this camera. The E-M5 Mark III, on the other hand, only has a standard grip available to it with 1 button. It's not a vertical grip. And they don't have any grips available with extra batteries so that you can extend the your running time. So, and I don't think Olympus is planning to release a vertical grip or battery grip for this camera, unfortunately. Now the E-M1 Mark II also has better frames per second in terms of continuous low speeds, continuous high speeds. Also has a bigger Pro Capture buffer of up to 60 frames raw in Pro Capture High, and higher frames per second in Pro Capture Low. And I'll put the specs up here between the differences. It's not a feature that I'm looking for, but if you're a serious sports photographer, that may be very important to you, how many frames per second you can capture. That could be a big deal. And that's really the only major difference, I think, between these two cameras in terms of capability. Now, a couple of things that the E-M5 Mark III has that the E-M1 Mark II does not is this has 1080p 120 frame per second video. And it's not something I really use a lot, but it is available on this camera. But it doesn't, autofocus doesn't work, so you have to lock focus first, and also there's no audio. But that's really true of any kind of high frame rate camera, right? Another thing this camera has is the Bluetooth capability, and I didn't see really any functional difference other than the It did connect to the app a little bit more consistently, and it did download images a little more consistently. And it also gives you the option to download images off your camera even when the camera's off. The cameras actually would be in standby mode, and you can still go into the camera and download the images onto your phone. Another major thing that this camera has that the M1 Mark II does not is the in-camera charging. So you can connect a USB 2.0 plug into the camera and charge the battery. So this is kind of handy if you're out in the field, let's say you're on a photo walk and then you go have some lunch. You can plug the camera into any outlet at Starbucks or whatever and charge it while you're having lunch, and then go back out into the field and start taking pictures again. Now, generally, I don't recommend you charge the camera battery in camera. I generally have it's easier to carry a couple extra spares, but it is an option available. Now, unfortunately, you cannot use the camera while it's charging, but you do have that option to charge the battery in camera now. Now, one thing I forgot to mention about the E-M1 Mark II is that the USB-C port does allow some additional functionality. You're able to tether this camera to the tethering software from Olympus, so it's really good for studio work. And you can also tether this camera to the Olympus Workspace photo editing software so that you can get faster editing done in Workspace, because a lot of people have complained how Workspace is very slow and clunky on the PCs and some Macs, but you can connect this camera to Olympus Workspace and it'll speed up the processing substantially, almost like you were working with the image in camera, but instead you're just working with it on the PC at that same speed. Now, with all of the differences I discussed between these two cameras, the way I use these cameras personally is this is my professional camera for my real estate work, primarily because it has the custom dial C1, 2, and 3, not because there's really any ergonomical or image quality advantages of this camera. It's merely a matter of workflow. And this camera is my everyday go-to camera for my photo walks and my vlogs, and just to enjoy photography, because it's just so compact and lightweight, and it's durable and it's weather sealed. And to me, this is really I think the best all-around camera for most people. The E-M1 Mark II clearly is made for professionals with the USB-C tethering, the dual card slots, the custom 1, 2, and 3 right here on the top, and then the additional pro capture and frames per second speeds that this camera is capable of. So I hope I've pointed out all of the things that I think are important when you're making a decision between these two cameras. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But as always, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you again soon.